Saint Teresa saw the soul of a person who gave up on God, because heaven felt silent. Have you ever prayed and felt nothing back? Have you ever begged heaven for an answer and heard only silence? Have you ever wondered if God abandoned you, if all those promises were lies, if faith itself was just wishful thinking dressed up as truth? Throughout history, countless believers have faced this terror, the silence, the void, the crushing weight of praying into darkness and getting nothing in return. Some endure it for weeks, others for months, a few for years. And then there are those who break, who decide silence means absence, who walk away believing heaven itself shut the door. Within this agonizing question stands one of the most documented cases in Christian history, Saint Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic who would become a doctor of the Church. The woman who founded 17 convents and wrote some of the most influential spiritual texts ever composed. But before any of that, before the visions and the ecstasies and the reforms, Teresa lived through 18 years of divine silence so complete, so crushing, that it nearly destroyed her, and what she discovered in that darkness would change everything we think we know about abandoned souls. Teresa of Avila was born March 28, 1515, in the city of Avila, Spain. Her birth name was Teresa Sánchez de Cepeda y Ahumada. Her father, Alonso Sánchez de Cepeda, was a wealthy wool merchant who had bought himself a knighthood, but there was a secret in the family history. Teresa's grandfather, Juan Sánchez de Toledo, was a converso, a Jew forced to convert to Christianity under threat of exile or death. In 1522, when Teresa's father was still a child, the Spanish Inquisition condemned Juan for allegedly returning to Jewish practices. The family barely survived the shame. Teresa grew up reading romance novels and lives of the saints. At age 7, she and her brother Rodrigo ran away from home to seek martyrdom fighting the Moors. An uncle spotted them just outside the town walls and dragged them back. When Teresa was 14, in 1529, her mother died. The loss gutted her. She turned to the Virgin Mary as her spiritual mother, begging her to fill the void. By age 16, Teresa's father sent her to the Augustinian convent school of Santa Maria de las Gracias in Avila. She stayed 18 months before illness forced her to leave. But something had shifted inside her during those months. The idea of religious life took root. In November 1535, at age 20, Teresa left her father's house without his permission and entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila. Her father eventually relented. On November 3rd, 1537, she made her final profession as a nun. Her new name was Teresa of Jesus. If you value documented spiritual history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Teresa's own autobiography, The Book of Her Life, written between 1562 and 1565, and preserved in the Institute of Carmelite Studies Critical Edition translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, and from detailed historical analysis in the life of Saint Teresa of Avila by Carlos Aire, published by Princeton University Press. These aren't general references. These are the primary documents and the most rigorous modern scholarship available. Now back to the information. Before 2 years had passed in the convent, Teresa's health collapsed. In autumn 1538, she went to stay with her half-sister Maria de Cepeda in Castellanos de la Canada. On the way there, she stopped at Hortigosa with her uncle Pedro de Cepeda. He gave her a copy of a book called The Third Spiritual Alphabet by Francisco de Osuna. That book taught her the prayer of recollection, a method of interior prayer that silenced the noise of the world and turned attention inward to find God. Teresa tried the method. For brief moments, she felt something, a presence, a warmth. But it didn't last. In April through July 1539, she underwent medical treatment at Bequetes. The treatments were brutal. On August 15, 1539, she suffered an attack of catalepsy that left her completely paralyzed for more than 8 months. They thought she was dead. They sealed her eyelids with wax. They wrapped her in a shroud. They dug a grave. After 4 days, she woke up, but the paralysis remained. Her left arm stayed partially paralyzed for the rest of her life. Physical pain became her constant companion. Migraines, fevers, heart pain, fatigue. But the physical suffering wasn't the worst part. During her long illness, Teresa stopped praying. She writes in her autobiography that she began to indulge in vanities, in gossip, in the shallow social life of the convent. The Incarnation housed 150 nuns. Visitors streamed in constantly, rich families, politicians, young men. The atmosphere felt more like a social club than a monastery. Nuns wore jewelry. They arranged their veils attractively. They competed for prestige based on wealth, not piety. Teresa got caught in it. She was charming. People liked her. She liked being liked. The convent asked her to entertain visitors because their gifts helped the economy. She taught them mental prayer, but she spent more time in flattery and gossip than spiritual guidance. Her soul, as she later wrote, was led astray by all these vanities. She became ashamed of turning toward God in the intimate friendship of prayer. For 18 years, Teresa struggled with prayer. 18 years. She writes that often she was more anxious for the hour of prayer to be over than she was to remain there. The sadness she felt on entering the oratory was unbearable. She had to muster all her courage just to walk through the door. She didn't know how to pray anymore. Her imagination wandered. Her feelings were numb. Every attempt felt like failure. Most historians and spiritual directors now believe Teresa's problem was one of technique. Her most recent biographer, Father Efren de la Madre de Dios, argues that Teresa didn't realize the mind and imagination can wander, while the soul, on a deeper level, remains quiet in barely perceptible contemplation. St. John of the Cross would later explain this distinction clearly, but Teresa had no guide, no teacher who understood what was happening to her. She felt abandoned by God. She felt like a failure at the one thing that mattered most. Here's what makes this so devastating. Teresa believed in God. She wanted God. She entered religious life specifically to find God, but when she tried to pray, she met only silence. No consolation, no sense of presence, no joy, just emptiness. And the longer it went on, the more convinced she became that God had rejected her, that she was unworthy, that maybe none of it was real. 18 years of showing up to pray and feeling nothing. Most people would have quit. Most people do quit. When prayer feels like talking to a wall, when heaven seems locked, when you beg and plead and get only silence, the logical conclusion is that no one's listening. Teresa came within inches of that conclusion. She stopped trying. She gave up on serious prayer. She let the social distractions fill the void. She convinced herself that she simply wasn't cut out for the spiritual life. Then, sometime around 1555, when Teresa was 40 years old, everything changed. She encountered a statue of the wounded Christ. The wounds were vivid, realistic. Something about the image broke through her defenses. She fell to the ground, weeping. Around the same time, she was reading the Confessions of St. Augustine. Augustine's tearful conversion under the fig tree mirrored what Teresa was experiencing. She projected herself into the text. She wept at the feet of the wounded Christ, just as Augustine had wept under that tree. This wasn't self-transformation as Teresa saw it. This was divine eruption, an act of God. As God had transformed Augustine in his moment of repentance and tear-soaked self-abandonment, so God was transforming Teresa in hers. Filled with new enthusiasm, she returned to spiritual reading and mental prayer. She started practicing the recollection she had learned years earlier from Osuna's book, and then the visions began, not immediately, but gradually. Teresa started experiencing what she called locutions, words she heard interiorly but not with her physical ears. She felt presences she couldn't see with physical eyes. Her soul began to experience the prayer of quiet, where God's presence overwhelmed her senses. Then came raptures, where God overcame her with what she called glorious foolishness. Then the prayer of union, where she felt the Son of God melt her soul away. Sometimes her whole body levitated. If she felt God about to raise her physically, she would stretch out on the floor and call the nuns to sit on her and hold her down. She begged God not to give her any more favors in public. But here's the critical part. Here's what changes everything. After those 18 years of darkness, after God finally broke through, Teresa experienced a vision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She describes it in chapter 32 of her autobiography. One day, while in prayer, the sweetness was so great that she began thinking about how much she had deserved to be in hell. And as she thought about this, her soul was carried away in spirit. She felt herself absorbed in the grandeur of God. In that state, a truth was revealed to her. She saw nothing, she heard no voice, but she knew. It was the truth itself speaking. And the truth said this: I was doing this to you, all those years of darkness, all that silence, all that abandonment you felt. I was doing this to you. It was not a slight matter. It is one of those things for which you owe me much. All the evil in the world comes from not knowing this truth clearly. Teresa understood in that moment that God had never left. During those 18 years when she felt abandoned, when heaven seemed silent, when she could barely force herself to pray, God was closer to her than he had ever been. The silence wasn't absence. It was presence too pure to be felt. The darkness wasn't rejection. It was purification. The emptiness wasn't God turning away. It was God stripping away everything between them. This is what makes Teresa's story so important. Because she didn't just experience the dark night, she lived through it and came out the other side with a message for everyone who's ever felt abandoned by heaven. The message is this: the silence doesn't mean God left. It means he's working deeper than feelings can reach. But Teresa saw something else, something darker, something that explains why some souls break under the weight of divine silence while others endure. In that same period of visions, Teresa saw hell. She describes it in chapter 32, beginning at section 1. While in prayer one day, she suddenly found herself seemingly placed in hell. The entrance looked like a very long, narrow passage, like a furnace, very low, dark, and confined. The ground consisted of dirty, muddy water emitting a foul stench and swarming with putrid vermin. At the end was a hollow place in the wall, like a small cupboard. There she found herself placed in cramped condition, but the physical horror was nothing compared to what she felt. She experienced a fire in her soul that she couldn't describe. Her bodily sufferings were unendurable. She had undergone most painful sufferings in life, but these were nothing in comparison. She saw that there would be no intermission, no end to them. She didn't see who tormented her, but she felt herself on fire and torn to pieces. And she repeats this. The worst was that interior fire and despair, the greatest torments of all. She couldn't sit or lie down. There was no room. The walls hemmed her in on every side. She couldn't breathe. There was no light, only thick darkness. She was so terrified by that vision that, though it took place nearly 6 years before she wrote about it, the natural warmth of her body was chilled by fear even while writing. The memory never left her. Teresa understood that God showed her this place for a reason. She writes that it was the place the devils had prepared for her there, which she had merited by her sins. This experience lasted only the briefest space of time, but even if she were to live for many years, she believed it would be impossible to forget it. But here's what she learned from it. Here's the truth that changed how she understood souls who give up. Teresa realized that the worst torture of hell wasn't physical, it was despair. It was the interior fire of knowing that hope was gone forever. It was the suffocation of being unable to hope for any consolation. It was the soul itself tearing itself to pieces because it had given up on God while there was still time. The damned didn't suffer because God abandoned them. They suffered because they abandoned God. They chose to interpret silence as absence. They chose to believe the darkness meant rejection. They gave up during the test. The tragedy was that God had been there the entire time, closer than they could feel, working in the silence, waiting for them to endure just a little longer. Teresa became obsessed with saving souls from this fate. She writes that the vision filled her with extraordinary pain for the many souls being condemned. She says that to free even one soul from such appalling torments, she would suffer many deaths very willingly. This was an abstract theology for her. This was urgent, because she had lived through the darkness. She knew what it felt like to believe God had abandoned her. She knew how close she had come to giving up. And she knew that on the other side of that darkness was a truth so beautiful it justified every moment of suffering. After her conversion experience around 1555, Teresa began to understand that God sometimes withdraws all consolation deliberately, not as punishment, as purification. The feeling of God's presence can become an addiction. Souls can chase the emotional high of spiritual consolation instead of seeking God himself. So God withdraws the feelings. He hides himself behind silence. And in that silence, the soul is forced to choose. Do you want the feelings, or do you want me? Will you serve me when it feels good, or will you serve me when it costs everything? Teresa found spiritual directors who helped her understand this. In 1557, she met Pedro de Alcantara, a Franciscan mystic known for his extreme asceticism. Pedro fasted constantly and slept no more than 2 hours a day. Teresa described him as emaciated to such an extreme that he seemed to be made of nothing but tree roots. But Pedro understood mystical experience. He assured Teresa that her visions and ecstasies were from God, not from demons. He told her not to resist them. She also consulted Francis Borgia, who would eventually become the third general of the Jesuit order. Francis consoled her greatly and advised her not to resist her divine trances and visions. These men gave her what she had lacked during those 18 years. They gave her the vocabulary to understand what was happening. They gave her permission to trust the experience. They gave her hope that the darkness had meaning. But even with their guidance, Teresa never forgot those 18 years. She never forgot what it felt like to pray and feel nothing. She never forgot the temptation to give up. And she never forgot the souls who didn't endure, the souls who decided silence meant absence and walked away. In 1560, Teresa had another vision that clarified everything. She describes this in her spiritual testimonies. After approximately 18 years of experiencing the dark night, our Lord appeared to her in a vision. Teresa, overwhelmed by finally seeing him after so long, asked the question that had tormented her for nearly 2 decades. "Where have you been all these years?" Jesus replied with words that would echo through Christian mysticism forever. "I was closer to you then than I am now." Think about what that means. During those 18 years when Teresa felt abandoned, when she could barely force herself to pray, when she was drowning in social distractions and worldly vanities and self-hatred, when she was convinced God had rejected her, Jesus was closer to her than he was in the moments of ecstasy and rapture that followed. The silence was intimacy. The darkness was union. The absence was presence, at a depth too profound for feelings to reach. This is the mystery that destroys our assumptions about abandoned souls. We assume that feeling close to God means being close to God. We assume that spiritual consolation equals spiritual health. We assume that silence means absence. But Teresa's experience proves otherwise. The soul that endures the dark night, that continues to show up and pray even when it feels like praying to a wall, that chooses to trust when there's no evidence to support that trust. That soul is experiencing a deeper union with God than the soul that chases consolation. But what about the souls who don't endure? What about the ones who give up? What about the person who prays for years and feels nothing and finally decides it's all meaningless? What happens to them? Teresa saw the answer in her vision of hell. She saw that the damned weren't there because God abandoned them during the silence. They were there because they interpreted the silence as abandonment and walked away. The test was never about feeling God's presence. The test was about trusting God's presence when you couldn't feel it. The souls who failed that test didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they believed the lie that silence equals absence. Here's the practical reality. During the dark night of the soul, everything inside you screams that you're wasting your time, that prayer is pointless, that God isn't listening, that faith is delusion. Every single rational argument supports giving up. The only reason to continue is naked trust in a promise you can't verify. You show up to pray, not because it feels good, not because you get anything out of it, not because you sense God's presence, but purely because you believe that God is there even when every shred of evidence suggests otherwise. Most people can't do that. Most people need to feel something. Most people need confirmation. And when they don't get it, they walk away. They're not evil. They're not rebellious. They're just logical. If you call out to someone and they don't answer, you eventually stop calling. The tragedy is that God was answering the entire time, just not in a language feelings can translate. Teresa spent the rest of her life trying to teach people this truth. In 1562, at age 47, she founded her first Reformed convent, the monastery of St. Joseph in Avila. It was small, poor, dedicated to strict enclosure and silent prayer. She went on to found 16 more convents across Spain over the next 20 years. She traveled constantly despite chronic illness. She wrote her autobiography, The Book of Her Life, between 1562 and 1565. She wrote The Way of Perfection between 1565 and 1566. And in 1577, at age 62, she wrote her masterpiece, The Interior Castle, an allegory of the soul's journey through 7 mansions to union with God. Everything she wrote was aimed at helping people understand one central truth. The dark night is not abandonment, it's intimacy. The silence is not absence, it's presence. And the souls who endure the darkness, who continue to pray when prayer feels pointless, who trust when trust requires everything, those souls are being prepared for a union with God that the souls who chase feelings will never experience. But Teresa never romanticized the dark night. She never pretended it was easy. She never said it didn't hurt. Her writings are filled with descriptions of the agony of spiritual desolation. She compares it to being placed in a hole in a wall where you can neither sit nor lie down. She describes it as suffocation, as a constriction so intense you feel like your soul is tearing itself in pieces. She says that many times she was more anxious for the hour of prayer to be over than to remain there. She admits that the sadness was unbearable. She's not encouraging people to suffer for suffering's sake. She's saying that when you find yourself in that darkness, when heaven feels silent, when you're convinced God abandoned you, don't give up. Because God is closer to you in that moment than he's ever been. And if you walk away, you're walking away from the very thing you're searching for. Teresa died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, while traveling back to Avila. She was 67 years old. Her last words were, "After all, I die as a child of the Church, and O my Lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time to meet one another." She was beatified by Pope Paul V in 1614, canonized by Gregory XV in 1622, and on September 27, 1970, Pope Paul VI proclaimed her the first female doctor of the Church in recognition of her spiritual legacy to Catholicism. Her body remains incorrupt, her relics are preserved in Avila, her heart shows signs of transverberation, the piercing she experienced in one of her mystical visions, and her writings continue to guide souls through the dark night more than 400 years after her death. But here's what we need to understand about Teresa's vision of abandoned souls. She didn't see a soul that got abandoned. She saw souls that abandoned God. The difference is everything. God never withdraws his presence. He sometimes withdraws the feeling of his presence. And that withdrawal is not cruelty, it's mercy. Because feeling God's presence is easy. Anyone can love God when it feels good. But loving God when it feels like nothing, when heaven seems locked, when you're praying into darkness and getting only silence, that love is pure. That love is tested. That love is real. The souls who give up during the silence aren't being rejected by God. They're rejecting God. They're choosing to believe that silence means absence. They're choosing to trust their feelings over God's promises. And the tragedy is that if they had endured just a little longer, if they had continued to show up and pray even when it felt pointless, they would have discovered what Teresa discovered, that God was there the entire time, closer than he had ever been, working in the silence, purifying the soul, preparing it for a union so profound that feelings would only get in the way. This is why Teresa became so passionate about saving souls. She understood that the real danger wasn't the dark night itself. The real danger was misinterpreting the dark night, thinking that silence means God left when it actually means God is working deeper than you can feel, thinking that the test is about enduring suffering when it's actually about choosing trust over evidence, thinking that giving up makes sense when it's the one thing that guarantees you'll miss what you're waiting for. In her writings, Teresa describes how to navigate the dark night. She says, first, remember that God is working even when you can't feel it. The silence doesn't mean he left. It means he's operating below the level of feelings. Second, show up anyway. Keep praying even when it feels pointless. The showing up is the prayer. Third, don't demand consolation. The desire for spiritual highs can become an addiction that blocks real union with God. Fourth, trust that the darkness has a purpose. God isn't testing whether you can feel him. He's testing whether you trust him when you can't feel him. And fifth, never give up. Because the moment you give up is the moment you trade temporary suffering for eternal loss. Teresa's message isn't that the dark night is pleasant. It isn't. Teresa's message isn't that everyone who endures the dark night becomes a mystic. Most don't. Teresa's message is simpler and more urgent. When heaven feels silent, don't assume God abandoned you, because the silence might be the deepest intimacy you've ever experienced. And if you walk away from it, you're walking away from the very presence you're searching for. The souls Teresa worried about weren't the ones suffering. They were the ones who decided suffering meant God wasn't real. They were the ones who gave up 5 minutes before the breakthrough. They were the ones who let silence convince them of absence, when silence was actually the loudest message God could send. Because sometimes the only way to prove your love is to strip away everything you're getting from the relationship and see if you stay anyway. God doesn't hide to torture you. He hides to test you. He withdraws the feelings to see if you want him, or if you just want the feelings he gives. And the souls who pass that test, who continue to pray when prayer feels dead, who show up when there's no reason to show up except naked trust in a promise. They can't verify. Those souls discover what Teresa discovered, that the worst moments of feeling abandoned were actually the moments of deepest union, that the times you felt farthest from God were the times he was preparing you for something feelings could never reach, that the silence wasn't rejection, it was love speaking in a language that doesn't need words. Teresa's vision of hell showed her that the damned aren't there because they suffered. They're there because they gave up. They chose to believe the darkness was final. They interpreted silence as the last word. And they walked away from God at the exact moment he was closest. The horror of hell, according to Teresa, isn't the fire. It's the realization that you gave up on God while he was still reaching for you. That you walked away from heaven because you couldn't feel it. That you traded eternity for the need to feel something now. This is why Teresa spent her final years founding convents and writing books and traveling despite illness and exhaustion. Because she had seen both sides. She had lived through 18 years of darkness that nearly destroyed her. She had experienced the breakthrough when God revealed he had been closer during the darkness than during the consolations, and she had seen the fate of souls who didn't endure. She knew that the difference between salvation and damnation often came down to one choice. Do you trust the promise when everything screams that the promise is a lie? Most people fail that test. Most people need evidence. Most people can't sustain faith when faith requires everything and gives nothing back. And Teresa understood that. She didn't judge them. She didn't condemn them. She just mourned them, because she knew they gave up 5 minutes before the sun rose. They walked away from the door just as God was opening it. They decided silence meant absence, when silence was actually the deepest conversation they'd ever have. In 1562, 8 years after her conversion experience, Teresa wrote something in a letter that captured everything she learned. She said, "God doesn't look at the greatness of our works, but at the love with which they're done. And the greatest love is the love that continues when there's no reward. When you pray because you promised to pray, not because it feels good. When you trust because you said you'd trust, not because you have evidence. When you show up because that's what love does, not because you're getting anything from it. That's the love God wants. That's the love the dark night tests. That's the love that survives the silence and discovers on the other side that the silence was never silence at all. It was God speaking too quietly for feelings to hear. It was God working too deeply for emotions to register. It was God loving in a way that required absolute trust because it offered zero confirmation. And the souls who gave up didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they believed feelings over promises. They failed because they thought silence meant God wasn't there. They failed because they walked away from the test instead of enduring it. And the tragedy Teresa saw in her vision wasn't that God abandoned them. It was that they abandoned God at the exact moment he was closest. They gave up on heaven while heaven was reaching for them. They decided the dark night was the end when it was actually the doorway to something they couldn't have imagined. Teresa of Avila saw that souls don't end up in hell because God rejects them during the silence. They end up in hell because they reject God during the silence, because they decide that feeling nothing means nothing is there, because they walk away from the test that would have proven their love was real, because they trade temporary darkness for permanent loss, because they give up, and God doesn't force them to stay. He doesn't drag them back, he just lets them go, because love without freedom isn't love. And the freedom to walk away is the same freedom that makes choosing to stay meaningful. The souls who endure the dark night, who pray when prayer feels dead, who trust when trust requires everything, those souls discover that the silence was never silence. It was intimacy at a depth feelings couldn't reach. It was God loving them in a way that required them to prove their love was real by stripping away everything they were getting from the relationship. That's what Teresa learned in those 18 years. That's what she tried to teach for the rest of her life. That's why she founded convents and wrote books and traveled despite exhaustion. Because she knew that the difference between salvation and damnation often came down to enduring the silence, to trusting the promise when everything screamed it was a lie, to showing up when there was no reason except love. The souls who gave up on God because heaven felt silent weren't abandoned by God. They abandoned God. And the horror of that choice doesn't fully reveal itself until the other side of eternity, when they realize that the silence they interpreted as absence was actually presence at a depth they couldn't feel, that the darkness they thought was rejection was actually purification, that the God they decided had abandoned them was closer during those moments of abandonment than he had ever been when they could feel him. Teresa died, believing that if she could save even one soul from that fate, it would be worth 1,000 deaths, because she had lived through the darkness. She knew what it felt like to believe God had abandoned her. She knew how close she came to giving up. And she knew that on the other side of that darkness was a truth so beautiful, so overwhelming, so completely worth every moment of suffering, that the only tragedy was giving up before you found it. That's the message she left behind. Not that the dark night is easy, not that everyone who suffers becomes a saint, but that when heaven feels silent, when you're convinced God abandoned you, when everything inside you screams to give up, don't. Because the silence isn't absence. It's intimacy. The darkness isn't rejection. It's purification. And the God you think abandoned you is closer to you in that moment than he's ever been in your life. On October 4th, 1582, when Teresa spoke her final words and closed her eyes for the last time, she wasn't afraid, because she had already died 1,000 deaths in those 18 years of darkness. And she had discovered that every single one of them was worth it, because on the other side of the silence was the voice she'd been listening for all along, and it said what it had always said, even when she couldn't hear it. I was never gone. I was just teaching you to trust me when you couldn't feel me, because that's when love is real. In 1664, 42 years after her canonization, a Carmelite nun named Maria of St. Joseph testified under oath that she had seen Teresa appear to her in a vision. Teresa told her something that perfectly captured everything she had learned. She said, "Heaven is full of souls who almost gave up, who endured the dark night by sheer stubbornness, who prayed when it felt pointless, who showed up when there was no reason except love. And hell is full of souls who gave up 5 minutes before the breakthrough, who decided silence meant absence, who walked away from God at the exact moment he was closest. The difference between them wasn't strength, it was choice. And the choice was simple. Do you trust the promise when you can't feel the presence?